Before we ride into this story, hit like and subscribe. Thank you. A World War II-era propeller plane once carried more bombs than a B-17, tangled with communist jets and lived to brag about it, and pulled hundreds of downed airmen out of jungles that were trying very hard to swallow them. And while it did all that, the Pentagon spent a decade and a fortune trying to replace it with sleek machines that were faster, newer, and, when it actually mattered, worse at the job. This is the story of the A-1 Skyraider. September 1st, 1968. Lieutenant Colonel William A. Jones III sat strapped into a cockpit designed before the atomic bomb had a name. Outside his canopy, Vietnam, green, wet, and hostile. Inside, the steady, comforting vibration of a 2,700 horsepower radial engine. The kind of engine that didn't hiss like a jet. It growled, deep and animal, like something you could feel in your teeth. Jones was about 90 miles from his base when the world turned impossible. Behind his headrest, the emergency extraction rocket, mounted there like a last-ditch miracle, ignited, not outside, not away from him. Inside the cockpit, there was a flash and a roar, and suddenly the back of his seat became a torch. Flames rolled forward. Smoke filled the space where oxygen was supposed to be. The metal around him heated like a stoveplate. The system was supposed to fire and yank him out in a heartbeat. It didn't. The mechanism was wrecked. The escape path was gone. And the rocket motor, meant to save him, was now cooking him alive. His hands that had flown combat missions, signed paperwork, held coffee mugs on quiet mornings, started to blister and peel. The pain wasn't sharp. It was vast. It swallowed everything. He reached for the extraction handle anyway. Nothing. He blew the canopy. The airflow fed the fire like bellows. Heat slammed his face and neck. The cockpit became a furnace with wings. Any sane person would have tried to jump. Jones didn't, because somewhere below, in that endless jungle, a downed pilot was hiding, motionless, terrified, listening to the forest for boots and shouted Vietnamese, and the coordinates to that pilot's position lived in exactly one place on Earth, in Jones's head. His radio was dead. The cockpit was burning. His arms and shoulders were turning into raw, blistered agony. So he did the only thing that made sense to a man who measured his life in duty and consequences. He turned the burning airplane toward home. 90 miles. 90 miles of smoke, flame, and third-degree burns. 90 miles of refusing to die because someone else might die first. When he finally landed at Nakhon Phanom, the Skyraider rolled in damaged and scorched like it had crawled out of hell. Jones was carried out and rushed towards surgery. But before the doctors could put him under, before morphine could dull the edges of the universe, he gave them what mattered: the coordinates. Later, on an operating table, he compared his burned hands to melted mozzarella. Somewhere else, a rescue helicopter and more Skyraiders went hunting. The downed pilot was pulled out the same day. Jones would be promoted. President Nixon would approve his Medal of Honor on November 14th, 1969. And then, because the universe is often crueler than war, Jones would die the next day, November 15th, in the crash of his personal Piper aircraft near Woodbridge, Virginia. He was 46. He had a PhD in philosophy. He never received the medal in person, but what he did in that cockpit became the clearest answer to a question the Air Force kept asking. Why were commanders still begging for propeller planes in the age of Mach 2? The problem the jets couldn't solve. By 1965, the United States had the most advanced combat aircraft on the planet, F-4 Phantoms that could rip through the sky at twice the speed of sound, F-105, Thunder Chiefs built for nuclear strikes at supersonic speed, afterburners, radar, missiles, brilliant engineering, the whole shining future bolted together with rivets and confidence. And yet, over Vietnam, field commanders kept requesting something that looked like it belonged in a museum. The Douglas A-1 Skyraider was designed in 1944. It first flew in March of 1945, months before World War II ended. It was a taildragger in an era moving toward tricycle gear, a piston engine brute in a turbine world. On carrier decks, it looked almost embarrassing next to the clean lines of jet fighters. Pilots jokingly called it the SPAD, a nod to the flimsy-looking biplanes of World War I, as if the Skyraider was some stubborn relic that refused to get with the times. But the SPAD had a secret that the jets didn't: time. An F-4 Phantom burned fuel like a man bleeding out. It could loiter over a target maybe 20 to 30 minutes before it had to leave. The Skyraider could orbit for 4 to 6 hours, sometimes 10. The F-105 often needed a tanker just to reach targets deep in North Vietnam. The Skyraider could launch, fly to the fight, drop ordnance for hours, and come home without refueling. And then there was payload, the number that made jet pilots feel a little sick. A B-17 Flying Fortress, the iconic heavy bomber of World War II, typically carried around 4,000 to 6,000 pounds of bombs. The single-engine Skyraider carried about 8,000. One pilot, one propeller, 15 external hardpoints, 4 20mm cannons, together throwing a stream of metal so fast it sounded like ripping canvas. Napalms, cluster bombs, white phosphorus, rockets, minigun pods. If you could bolt it to the wing, the SPAD could haul it into the sky and deliver it with ugly precision. Once in November 1965, someone even bolted a toilet to the wing. Commander Clarence Bill Stoddard of VA-25 aboard USS Midway wanted to commemorate the 6 millionth pound of ordnance dropped. His crew found a damaged porcelain toilet, rigged tail fins and a fuse, and sent it downrange like a crude joke falling from the heavens. A forward air controller later reported it whistled on the way down. That that story is funny, the next part isn't, because the same slow speed that made jets impressive made them almost useless for one mission that haunted every pilot, saving the guy on the ground. When an American aircrew was shot down over Laos or North Vietnam, they didn't need something fast. They needed something that would stay. Sandy, and the art of refusing to leave the Skyraider, became the guardian of rescue operations under a call sign that sounded like a nickname from a dusty bar room: Sandy. If you were a fast jet pilot and Sandy walked into the bar, tradition said he'd have trouble paying for his drink, because everyone else would cover it. Here's how a Sandy rescue worked when everything went right, which was rarely. A pilot goes down. He hides in jungle. Enemy troops spread out like ink in water. Sometimes he can whisper into a survival radio. Sometimes all anyone has is a last known position and a prayer. Then 4 Skyraiders arrive and begin flying low, dangerously low, at treetop level, almost inviting the jungle to shoot back. They called it trolling for fire. Fly slow, fly low, dare the enemy to reveal themselves. Because the moment a gun fired, just a puff, a flash, a trace, the Skyraiders rolled in, cannons hammering, napalm blooming like hell's flowers, rockets slashing into tree lines. The 4 aircraft would form a daisy chain, a constant circle over the survivor. As one pulled off, the next was already diving. An unbroken curtain of violence meant to keep enemy heads down, while a rescue helicopter, often a big green beast, crept in beneath the chaos. The enemy learned quickly. They began using survivors as bait. They'd surround the downed pilot with anti-aircraft guns and wait for the Skyraiders to come hunting low and slow. A trap designed for aircraft that refused to abandon the battlefield. May 31st, 1968. The trap closes. Navy Lieutenant Kenny Fields, callsign Streetcar 304, was shot down near one of the most heavily defended stretches of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. It was his first combat mission. For 40 hours, the sky over that jungle became a grinding machine. 189 sorties were flown to save one man. Aircraft were lost or heavily damaged. A Sandy pilot was captured and would spend 5 years as a prisoner in Hanoi, but they got Fields out. The numbers around combat search and rescue were brutal. In one squadron alone, dozens of Skyraiders and pilots were lost running rescues. Across the broader rescue war, Medals of Honor, Air Force Crosses, dozens killed, because the mission demanded aircraft that would stay in the teeth of gunfire and pilots who would keep diving until the jungle stopped shooting. Which brings us back to Jones. The man in the fire Jones was flying as Sandy 01 on his 98th combat mission when 2 F-4 Phantoms were shot down near the Ho Chi Minh Trail. One crew was recovered. The other pilot was still hiding near Jong Hoi. Jones made repeated low passes through intense anti-aircraft fire to locate the survivor. When he spotted him, he didn't just mark the position and back away. He saw a multi-barrel gun position on a nearby karst formation, a rocky rise that was basically a natural machine gun tower. He attacked it. On the second pass, rounds tore into his aircraft. One struck the extraction rocket system behind his headrest, and you know what happened next. Fire where there should have been escape. Silence where there should have been radio. A burning cockpit, second and third degree burns across his arms, hands, neck, shoulders, and face. And still, the decision: fly home. Report the coordinates. Save the man he had found. The downed pilot was rescued later that day. Jones didn't live long enough to wear the medal, but his story became part of the Skyraider's legend. A plane so stubborn and a mission so unforgiving that a man would rather fly while on fire than risk losing one set of numbers. And yes, this prop plane shot down jets. The Skyraider wasn't just a flying bomb rack or a rescue guardian. On rare days, it embarrassed the very jets that were supposed to replace it. June 20th, 1965. 4 A-1H Skyraiders from VA-25 launched from USS Midway on a rescue patrol over North Vietnam. They were cruising at 12,000 feet at around 170 knots. Airliner speed, not fighter speed. 2 MiG-17s appeared. A MiG-17 could scream past 600 knots. The Skyraider topped out around 320 on a good day. By every rule of aviation, this should have been a slaughter. The Skyraider pilots dove for the deck, into the thick air where trees flashed beneath them. And here, the math changed. Jets hate slow speeds, they hate tight turns. They overshoot. The Skyraider had a stall speed down around the range of barely flying, and it could pivot in the sky in ways that made jet pilots feel like they were wearing roller skates on ice. The MiGs kept flashing past, too fast to bite. Then, in a twist of terrain and timing, 2 Skyraiders came around a small hill and found a MiG lined up behind one of their own. The MiG turned for a head-on pass. Both prop pilots fired. 8 20mm cannons spoke at once. The MiG's canopy shattered. The jet rolled inverted and slammed into a hillside. A propeller plane had just killed a jet. October 9th, 1966. Another encounter. 4 A-1HS from VA-176 off USS Intrepid were jumped by 4 MiG-17S. One Skyraider pilot got behind a MiG and opened fire until his cannons ran dry. So he did something that sounds like a bad joke until you remember war is full of them. He armed his 5-inch unguided rockets, designed for bunkers, and fired them at a jet fighter. The MiG spun out of control, disappeared through a cloud deck, and died. That would be remembered as the last time in aviation history a propeller propeller-driven aircraft shot down a jet. Final tally: Skyraider scored confirmed MiG kills. The MiG scored none against the Skyraider in a fair fight. March 10, 1966, the rescue that broke the rules. In the A Valley, a special forces camp was under siege, thousands of North Vietnamese troops pressing in on a tiny defended position. The weather was catastrophic: low ceilings, hilltops swallowed by cloud. Jets couldn't work the area, the world was too tight, too blind. But Skyraiders could find holes in the clouds, could slip through gaps like thieves. A pilot compared it to flying inside a stadium while people in the stands shot at you. Major Bernard Fisher led a group of Skyraiders when another pilot took a hit, likely heavy anti-aircraft, and started burning. Fisher radioed that the aircraft was on fire, flames trailing back. The damaged Skyraider belly landed on the camp's rough, steel-planked runway, skidded, and the pilot dove out into a ditch as the aircraft exploded behind him. He tried to crawl to safety, blundered into a minefield, crawled back. Enemy troops were within a couple hundred yards. A helicopter was still half an hour away, which might as well have been a year. Fisher looked at the runway, cratered, strewn with debris, and said, in essence, "I'm going in." He landed his Skyraider under fire, taxied the full length, and pulled up near the stranded pilot. The man sprinted through gunfire, scrambled up onto the wing, and Fisher physically hauled him into the cockpit by the collar, dragging him in headfirst like a drowning man pulled onto a boat. Then Fisher taxied back through shell holes and took off with his aircraft punched full of bullet holes. It was so audacious it sounded fictional. Fisher became the first living Air Force Medal of Honor recipient of the Vietnam War, and the message was simple: when a man is down, you don't leave him there. The cost of stubborn heroism: over 9 years, US Skyraiders flew tens of thousands of combat sorties. Hundreds were lost across services. Air Force pilots died at a rate that made the community quietly superstitious. Roughly 1 in 7 who flew combat tours. The South Vietnamese Air Force flew them even longer, losing hundreds more across nearly 15 years of continuous fighting. And through all of it, the Pentagon kept trying to retire the airplane. There was a strange, almost bureaucratic comedy to it. A mid-1960s article captured the absurdity. No aircraft then in production or even on the drawing board could truly replace the Skyraider, and yet it was being displaced anyway. The Navy pulled Skyraiders from carriers to make room for nuclear bombers at the exact moment submarines were taking over much of the nuclear mission. At the exact moment America was fighting a limited war where slow, loitering, close support mattered more than speed records. In 1972, during the Easter Offensive, the Air Force found itself short of flyable Skyraiders. Missiles and wear had gutted the fleet. Still, the aircraft stayed in the fight. South Vietnamese pilots flew Skyraiders to the very last day, April 30th, 1975. A South Vietnamese pilot later described flying back with roughly 24 people crammed into the rear of an A-1E, an attack aircraft turned lifeboat, trying to outrun the collapse of a nation. When he landed in Thailand, American soldiers met him with leveled rifles. They took weapons and flying gear. The pilots were devastated, not because they didn't understand the procedure, but because it felt like arriving at the end of the world and being told to empty your pockets. Why the sound mattered? Ask men who were wounded in Vietnam what it meant to hear a Skyraider. They'll tell you it wasn't the shape or the paint or the insignia, it was the sound. That deep radial growl circling overhead for hours, refusing to leave. The unmistakable promise that someone was still working the problem. A rescued F-105 pilot once put it with a grin. The Skyraider was one of the prettiest airplanes in the world, second only to the Jolly Green rescue helicopter that came in under its protection. And if you doubt that, imagine lying in a ditch, bleeding, listening to distant voices and closer footsteps. Then imagine that growl appears above the tree line. Not for a pass, not for a quick strike, but to stay. The punchline history couldn't resist. In 2025, the US Air Force gave its new armed Overwatch turboprop a name that sounded like a confession: A-1 Skyraider 2. 80 years after the original first flew, they were still trying to build what Ed Heinemann and his team built in 1944, a simple, brutal aircraft that could carry an absurd load, fly forever, take punishment, and protect the people who couldn't run. They've gotten closer, but the old truth still hangs in the air over Vietnam like exhaust haze. Speed is impressive, but endurance saves lives, and sometimes the most modern thing you can do in war is bring back the thing that never should have worked, and watch it work anyway.